Are you one of those people who sat in maths class and wondered, when will this stuff ever be useful? Well, your long wait is finally over. We're at the 17th meeting of the Maths in Industry Study Group right here at the University of Zululand in South Africa to discover how real-world problems are being solved with mathematics.
Have you ever walked under a fruit tree and listened to those bees buzzing overhead? And did you ever wonder what they're doing? And did you ever wonder what would happen if they took a break? As temperatures rise around the world, natural systems are being disrupted. And in response to increasing temperatures, flowers are blooming earlier and bees are also starting to emerge from the hive earlier. So, what would happen if flowers bloom and there aren't any bees around to pollinate them? That's the question we're asking today at the Maths and Industry Study Group here at the University of Zululand. And I'm joined by a number of researchers, mathematicians, and industry specialists to talk about this particular topic. So in the studio with me, I've got Jennifer Fitchett and a number of her associates in maths and statistics. Jennifer Fitchett is Associate Professor at Wits University in Physical Geography, Phenology, and Climate Change. Welcome, Jennifer, and could you start with telling us what is phenology?
Phenology refers to the timing of annually recurrent biological events, and those differ between plants and animals, but they can include the timing of flowering, the timing of leaf coloration and fall and autumn, and in plants it could involve the time of hibernation or the time of migration of a particular animal.
So what is this big concern with the potential for flowers and bees to not come out at the same time each year?
So what concerns us is that the rates of change of advance of these two different species might be different. And if they are different, we're going to end up in a position where you might have your bees appearing when there are no flowers yet, or flowers appearing when there aren't any bees yet. And that has a huge implication for the bees that won't find any food, but it also has an implication for the plants that won't be cross-pollinated by the bees, which would then prevent the development of fruit on those particular species.
So why would this happen?
So in any plant or animal, the triggering of a spring event, whether that's the emergence from a hive in a bee or the timing of flowering in a plant, is that plant or animal experiencing the shift out of winter. And that's usually an increase in temperature that signals to the plant or the animal that it's no longer in winter and it needs to emerge from its dormant period. The challenge is that each plant and animal has a slightly different trigger for that spring event. And because these triggers are slightly different, it means that in a warming climate, that 1 degree or 2 degree temperature increase could mean to a plant we need to start flowering a week earlier, and it might mean to the bee that we need to emerge from the hive 2 weeks earlier, because that trigger might be a slightly different threshold temperature or a different accumulation of heat above a certain threshold.
And what if we don't have pollination taking place? Are you saying we might not have honey, or is it a bit more serious than that?
It means we might not have any honey, we might not have any bees. So at this point, a lot of us are concerned about the extinction of any species. And so we should be concerned about the bees themselves. But if we are going to be very selfish and worry about our own needs, a lack of cross-pollination means the inability of a plant to be able to produce a fruit. So if you own an apple orchard and the bees have come and gone before your plants start to flower, it means that none of those apple trees are able to develop fruits from those flowers. And that means a failed yield for that particular year, and it will mean a failed yield for all future years if those bees have managed to find no food at all from any other plant and have gone extinct in that local area.
And I presume this could be happening for bees, but it could be happening for every other species.
Yeah, absolutely. And already we're starting to see mismatches between caterpillars and oak leaves. We're seeing mismatches between predators and prey across a lot of different species.
What are the factors that affect the blooming date of flowers, the emergence of insects?
So for flowers, it's a triggering response to the accumulation of cold temperatures during the dormant period. So we need to meet a certain amount of cold units during our dormancy and during winter, and then a transition into warmer temperatures. And for a plant, that's usually an accumulation of heat above a certain threshold over a certain period of time. For some, it's much more simplistic. So it's just a net warming above a certain threshold that will trigger the event. And for some, it's much more complex and also includes factors such as the length of day or the amount of rainfall or the timing of onset of rainfall. For bees, the best estimates that have been derived in areas where they're able to observe bees is that it's a function of the temperature and the latitude, which then affects the length of day and the transition in the length of day from your very short day lengths in winter to your much longer day lengths in summer.
And if we have got data about how this is happening, why can't we just take that data and extend it or extrapolate it, see what's happening elsewhere and apply it locally?
So one of the interesting things about phenology is that it's been found across many studies globally to be very location and species specific. So if you look across one particular species, let's say Granny Smith apples, and we standardize for temperature, they're advancing at a rate of 4.2 days per degree Celsius in Cape Town, but 2.4 days per degree Celsius in Poland. So within one species, we can't replicate it across different locations. And if we take one location, if we take the example of citrus in a particular location, those rates of change differ among species. So we aren't able to just replicate a rate of change from one location and transpose it onto another location. We need to start to look at things by drilling down to what is the trigger within that particular species and how are various different climate variables changing for that particular location over a set period of time.
What kind of periods of time? Can't we gather a little bit of data and make some projections?
So we're talking about a minimum of 30 years time period if we want to talk about climate change. Those are statistical requirements set by the World Meteorological Organization. And 30 years is quite a long period of time in the climate crisis. We can't time travel back to go back and re-watch these plants and these bees for the previous 30 years. And if we were to start observing them today for the next 30 years going forward, yes, we would gain some valuable information and some valuable data, but in the case of mismatch, it may already have happened by that point in time.
So it sounds like a really complex challenge. What do we do?
So we've done what we can from the perspective of physical geographers. We've collected the data that we can from documentary sources. We've done the best that we can to assimilate data from our colleagues who work in the fields of biology. We've reached our limits. And it's now the point where we need to start to lean on the skills from mathematicians who are able to use modeling approaches, to use the kind of data sets that they have in North America, match that with the very coarse information that we have in Southern Africa, and come up with some estimate of the mismatch so that we'd then be able to zoom in and in a particular year and a particular location, test whether these models are true and observe for 1 or 2 years rather than the next 30 years.
So we're talking about creating some kind of a picture about what's causing flowers to bloom and another picture about what's causing bees to emerge and trying to see how those pictures relate to one another. So in pictures, that sounds easy enough. In real terms, it becomes a really complex challenge. And so through this maths and industry study group that we're a part of at the University of Zululand today, a group has been getting together to try and apply some mathematical approaches to some of these problems. So I'd like to welcome Selina Mhlanga. Selina is an honors candidate at the University of the Witwatersrand, and she is a researcher in applied mathematics. So welcome, Selina, and can you tell us a little bit more about how do we apply mathematics to predict the flowering date of plants?
Thank you. So, factors that mainly affect plant and tree blooming are temperature, day length, rainfall, aspect, slope, and a few others. However, temperature is the main drive. Hence, our models that we looked at have temperature as an input. We looked at a couple from literature, obviously, the Bidabi model, the Uta model, the Anderson model. And due to the fact that daylight plays an important role in photosynthesis, which is affected by light, the progressive Uta model was the best choice that we could find that incorporates both temperature and daylight. And we did take that model and we did compare it with Jacaranda data that we had, and it did perform quite well because it did show that the days that jacarandas are blooming is quite decreasing. So we use what we call the Julian day to record what day the blooming will be at.
So tell us a little bit more about the work that you've been doing with jacarandas. Is that an example of using a mathematical model to predict an outcome?
Definitely. So with the jacarandas, last week when we had our study group session, we were taking a couple of things. For example, your temperature, minimum temperature, maximum temperature, your rainfall data, and we used that data to predict the first flowering date. From there, we discovered that it does actually work while using records from newspapers that we actually have. So the records that we got from newspapers was just a range of blooming within, the jacaranda plant. And we also tried a machine learning approach, which was showing very good results. So I believe that a mathematical model does actually work when it comes to jacarandas.
So that jacaranda study sounds fascinating. Was that your work, or is it building on the previous work of other researchers?
It's actually work that builds on what Jennifer and her two students, Andile Fani and Kestrel Rake, actually did. So they took newspapers and social media data to come up with a really good data set that we actually used for this study.
Yeah, they did a lot of the legwork in going through newspaper articles that dated back to 1919 and more recently some social media records over the past 5 years, capturing every time anyone in the media or in social media has ever written about jacarandas or jacaranda blossoms and compiling that into the data set that we were able to then compare to the models produced by Selena and her group.
I want to explore this idea of a mathematical model. How would you describe a mathematical model? What is a model?
A model is a way of understanding the given scenario and the mechanisms that are involved in it, and it should also be able to predict maybe what's going to happen in the future. For example, the jacarandas that we have, we're trying to see, okay, with the given temperatures and with the weather and climate changing, how is it going to change over time? The mathematical model is supposed to do that, and it should also be able to be compared to experimental data and, observed data to actually see if there's a correlation between the model and the actual true observed data in the real world.
So with the jacarandas, tell us how you had an opportunity to check that the model was working.
Jennifer, our leader, she actually gave us newspaper dates. Someone recorded that, okay, there is blooming in maybe Pretoria or Joburg, the city is purple. So that was a reference. We're able to just see a range to see, okay, so if I get my first day of flowering, does it at least match with when the person wrote this article? So that we use that in order to just check the range, and I think we're within the range.
So that took care of the flowers, but now we need to have a look at the bees. So we've got with us Ashley Hutchinson. Ashley Hutchinson is Deputy Director of the Centre of Excellence in Mathematical and Statistical Sciences at the University of the Witwatersrand and is a specialist in mathematical modelling. What are some of the factors that go into a model for bees?
The first thing is we actually have to understand how bees behave. As mathematicians, we have very limited knowledge about this. So this is where collaboration is just so important. We have Jennifer, who is an expert, and she can assist us with all the questions that we may have. So the first task was to understand how bees behave. And from that behavior, we can create a mathematical model that can represent each aspect of, let's just say, a beehive. So for instance, we could take into account hive bees and foragers. The foragers are the ones that visit the plants. And using a mathematical model, we can predict population numbers and see how those change over the years based on external influences such as an earlier blossoming day.
So yesterday we saw a board full of equations that tried to represent how bees, or how and when bees emerge. Could you tell us about some of the elements that went into the creation of those equations?
Sure. Well, it's very important in mathematical modeling to start off as simple as possible. You don't want to incorporate too many factors, as it could complicate the model, lead to a decrease in accuracy, which will further not enable us to understand anything about the situation. So we like to start off simple, and that's very, very busy board with all those equations. That was actually our idea of simplicity. So again, we'll have to revisit that, perhaps go even simpler. But what we're looking at currently is basically from the starting stages of a bee when it's in the brood out to the stage where it becomes a forager. And that depends on a whole lot of different factors, food storage being one of the main criteria. Bees will tend to change from being hive bees to forager bees when there is a decrease in the food. And that happens generally just before blooming, where the new bees are, eggs are laid, new bees are hatching, and more food is required to maintain the hive. So the issue is that this food supply is running out quicker, bees are leaving the hive, and flowers are not necessarily there and available for the pollen to be collected. So what we were looking at is what's called a compartmental model, where we have a separate equation that describes each of those stages, and it also describes how you get from one stage to the next. So for instance, the queen lays a whole lot of eggs, you get some mortality rate, you get some of those surviving, becoming hive bees, which maintain the hive. Those then can become forager bees, and that's due to a whole lot of factors. The one that we're looking at is food shortages, because they replenish their food storage by collecting the pollen.
So we've now got these two sets of equations. We've got a set of mathematical equations that tells us when the flowers will be coming out, and we've got a set of mathematical equations that tell us when the bees will be ready to pollinate those flowers. How do we put all of that together? So we're chatting now to Willard Vache, who is a PhD candidate in statistics at the University of Zululand, with a specialization in statistics and climate modeling. Welcome, Willard, and can you tell us how we put these models together and try and make some meaning out of them?
All right, so what you have here is at one end, we have a model that describes the time when the bees are going to come out and try to pollinate the flowers. Then on the other end, we have the model that describes the blossoming of flowers. So what we can do is we have those two models and try to model and see what's the lag between the two, the blossoming model and also the bees model. So for example, there was a study that was carried out in France where they showed that the variability that was found in France, where suddenly the snow suddenly melted, and now there was warmer days that were experienced, and the bees were actually thought maybe we are now in spring, and they came out earlier, and it actually affected the pollination during that period. So in our study that we are doing in this group is we are trying to find out whether how is it going to be affected if we compare those two models, the blossoming model and the other model, which is now looking at the bees at the time, which try to predict the time that they're going to come out to do the pollination.
And what will we be able to do with that information? So, for instance, if we do discover that under certain possible conditions in the South African context, we're going to get that mismatch, what can be done about it?
Yes, that now goes back even to the policymakers to say maybe us as academics, we've come up with a model that says this is going to happen. It also affects even our food chain in the long run.
So I think farmers are particularly interested in this because if they are aware of some of the advancing phenological events in their species, and farmers are increasingly aware of this, and they're seeing their yields decline, by being able to understand that one of the key roles is the mismatch between your bees and your pollination, you can start to move bees to locations where the temperature is such that their advance is not as dramatic. So you're artificially then inducing an overlap between the bees and the flowers. Humans are also able to change what they're growing in a particular location or what location they're growing that particular plant of interest in. And so by moving the plants to the bees and the bees to the plants and starting to align these flowering dates, we're able to address some of these problems. There are also more extreme measures that can be put into place by either irrigating an area, so you're inducing an earlier flowering or a later flowering, or starting to protect some of the trees by protecting them from the colder frost events. We can start to adjust some of these flowering dates if we know where and when the problem will occur.
Well, that sounds fantastic and a really worthwhile endeavor and a real opportunity that's being provided by the collaboration between mathematicians and other researchers to try and understand and pick apart complex problems that we're facing. I'm interested in your reflections on being part of this process. So perhaps I can ask if, Selena, if there were any aha moments that took place for you during this process of working together with the industry to understand the problems they're facing.
Definitely. So I'm someone who just finished their undergrad, and I'm not really used to research work. We've been working for the past week on a problem, and like I said, we're using the progressive UTA model. But then today we discovered that it's not so efficient. So I think as a young researcher or someone who's planning to go into research, that was kind of, really? So I think it is an aha moment because we discovered that the way we were doing things was not efficient and it wasn't giving maybe the desired results at the end of the day. So now we have to adopt another approach. So that was a really good aha moment. And also, I think as a group, now we have to quickly adapt to the new model or new data that we are using in order to solve the problem. So that was really good.
Great. And do you have some data? Are you able to simplify the problem that you've got by working with a little bit of data that you do have?
Definitely. So we had Jacarandas last week when we were working, but now we have airport data that we can actually use. So it's studies that have been done, literature, their publications. So now we can take that data and we can use it in our model to simplify a whole lot of things.
Fantastic. And does this experience change the way in which you think about and approach your research? Willard, maybe you've got some thoughts on that.
Yes, definitely it does. Like for me, on the verge of just finishing my PhD, so I was kind of looking at what can I now do in terms of postdoc. So it kind of now shifted my interests to now apply my climate modeling experience that I have to go into more practical things that we face day to day, like in this case, bees and pollination. How is it going? How can I apply my climate modeling into that and try to come up with some solutions?
And Ashley, to what extent is it necessary to work in an interdisciplinary way in order to solve some of these challenging problems that we face?
In order to conduct groundbreaking research, it's an absolute necessity. People from different academic backgrounds are required to work on a problem. For instance, as mathematicians, we don't know the biology of plants and bees, but we do know maths. And I think merging different fields of research always results in the most useful mathematical models that can be developed. We've learned a lot from Jen about biology and geography, a whole lot of stuff about climate change. And we hope that in return, perhaps she's also seen how our approaches, mathematical approaches, can be of value. It's been a bit of a challenge communicating as mathematicians. I don't think it's something that we're very used to. So trying to transform our work and explain our work in a way that someone not in the field can also understand has probably been the most challenging but most useful experience.
And I'm always interested in the science communication and research communication questions. So do you think that your communication skills can improve through this kind of work?
I think we learn a lot about being able to communicate between disciplines and also being able to communicate to yourself through the thinking process. Often as researchers, we become very siloed in our own thinking and in our own discipline. And the longer you work in a particular discipline, the worse that becomes. And being put into an environment like this where you have to be able to work through a problem, often multiple times over, and explain it from many different angles, you get a much better understanding of it for yourself, and you start to understand where the breaking points are in communication with other people. So it's often not about the one big word. It's very easy to explain to somebody perhaps what the word phenology means, but in being able to explain a problem over and over again until you're all on the same page about what it is that you're trying to solve, and going through a model where often I would just skip past that page in a paper and move on to find the really juicy parts that I'm looking for, it allows us to understand these mechanisms so much better because we're slowing down communication, we're rethinking communication, and we're rethinking some of those language tools that we need to be able to break something down into much simpler components.
Well, that sounds really fascinating and sounds really worthwhile, and a fascinating use of mathematics to try and give us understanding and insight in what we can do about one of these serious challenges that is facing us in our world today. Thanks very much to everyone for fascinating insights and a really exciting conversation. We're going to say goodbye to Willard, to Ashley, to Selena, and to Jennifer, and to thank you all very much for your valued contributions. We really look forward to discovering more of what your collaboration delivers.
The South African Mathematics and Industry Study Group was founded by Professor David Mason in 2004 at Wits University and has created exciting opportunities for collaboration between mathematics researchers and industries facing complex problems. The 2020 event is hosted at the University of Zululand and is supported by the DSI NRF Center of Excellence in Mathematical and Statistical Sciences, the Herman Althover Trust, and the African Institute for Mathematical Sciences. This podcast was sponsored by the Center of Excellence in Mathematical and Statistical Sciences, an initiative of the Department of Science and Innovation and the National Research Foundation.